Hi, I'm Caroline Clark, conference producer at Technology Networks, and I'm here to introduce our last talk of the day, Digitization of Scientific Research Requirements, Barriers and Logistics. I'm pleased to welcome Samantha Kanza as your presenter. Samantha is a Senior Enterprise Fellow at the University of Southampton. She coordinates the AI for Scientific Discovery Network and the Future Blood Testing Network. She also works on her own research following her PhD in the Digitization of Scientific Research, Smart Labs and the Lab of the Future, and semantic tagging for scientific data, which is continued as part of her Physical Science Data Infrastructure project. As well as this, Samantha also works on several semantic web projects across different domains such as drug discovery, agriculture, and the social sciences, and runs her ethics working group. A warm welcome to you, Samantha. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, and we'll welcome any questions that you may have. Please ask questions using the Q&A system to the right-hand side of the video player. You can also use this feature to connect with attendees and discuss the talk, so feel free to take advantage of the chat system by introducing yourself and sharing your thoughts during Samantha's presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please request help using the technical help icon menu on the left-hand side of the player. Now, without further ado, I will hand over to Samantha to begin her presentation.
Thanks very much, Caroline. Hi, everyone. And I just want to say a big thank you to Caroline for inviting me along to talk at this event. And as Caroline said, today I'm going to be talking to you about the requirements, barriers and logistics of digitizing scientific research. So just to give you a bit of an outline, I'm going to introduce myself and talk a bit about how all of this research got started. I'm then going to give an overview of the landscape of digitization and then talk about some of the major barriers that still exist today and finish up with the technical and data requirements. So first, I'm going to talk a bit about me and a bit about the projects that I currently work on. So as Caroline said, I'm Dr. Samantha Kanza. I work at the University of Southampton and also at the University of Reading. My job title is Senior Enterprise Fellow, but that doesn't really explain what I do. But part of that is running the two research networks, so AI for Scientific Discovery and the Future Blood Testing Network. So if either of those are interesting to you, obviously feel free to ping me questions about that, or I'm sure that Caroline can make my contact details available to talk offline about those. But when I'm not doing that, I also work as a researcher. And at the moment, the main focus of my research, which has actually been the main focus for a long time, 8 years, in fact, is the digitization of scientific research. So trying to improve research data management and also using semantic web technologies to improve how scientific data is represented. So to give you a bit of background, I'd like to make a confession. I'm not a chemist at all. I am, in fact, a computer scientist masquerading in our chemistry department. I trained initially as a computer scientist, and then I got into the web science doctoral training program. So web science is a really interesting subject, and it basically studies the web as a socio-technical phenomena. So whereby the human element is just as important as the technology, and that actually advances in the technology are just as down to the humans as the actual technical implementations. Now, I've always found this a really interesting concept, and I wanted to find a discipline that I could use my technical knowledge and skills in, but also that really looked to address that sort of human element and look at real human problems. As one of my bugbears about computer science is that sometimes I feel like applications or projects don't always fully take into account those human requirements and don't always actually look to address a specific problem or a specific need. And through a friend of a friend, I came across my chemistry supervisor, Professor Jeremy Frey, who had done some really fun-looking stuff with digitization, smart labs, semantic web technologies. I asked him to be my supervisor, and the rest, as they say, is history. So when I was fast looking at potential topics for my PhD, the notion of digitizing scientific research came up quite quickly, as it aligned with a lot of my interests. And as a computer scientist, I was utterly baffled that so much work was still being done on paper. It seemed really alien to me, as whilst admittedly I do use a paper notebook, and I do very much understand the affordances of paper for quick and easy notes. I've always stood by the notion that anything on paper should also exist electronically, so that if I forget or lose, or more likely spill tea all over my notebook, none of the actual information is lost, because it's all on a computer. I then found out about electronic lab notebooks, ELNs, and thought, Well, I mean, obviously that's the answer, isn't it? I guess I'll just go and find whatever, I don't know, Apple, Microsoft, Google version of an ELN exists. And obviously that's the one people are going to use. End of story. Sorted. Do I even need to do a PhD on this? But needless to say, I did not find the Apple, Google, or Microsoft of ELNs. And I did not stumble upon a magical solution, which from a PhD perspective is probably good, as that would have made for a very short and boring write-up. But I spent pretty much all of my PhD studying the digitization of scientific research, mostly from an academic perspective. And some of the initial conclusions I came to were that people just weren't ready to give up on paper. Bear in mind, this was back in 2018, that there were a lot of logistical barriers and issues, and that there was still a lot of work to be done. So fast forward to 2022, and our project group won a bid to work on the Physical Sciences Data Infrastructure project. And I was asked to work on the process recording and digital research notebook study. So this was 4 years on from my PhD. I'd kept up the research, I'd written some papers, but I was really excited to get a proper, in-depth research opportunity to delve back into this field and see what had changed. So the current landscape of digitization that I'm going to speak about shortly is made up of a lot of different types of research. So firstly, systematic literature reviews across the last 8 years, software investigations, which was an absolute eye-opener. Just as I had wrongfully assumed there wouldn't be that many ELNs, and the things might be quite simple, I also had no idea how much software existed in the physical sciences. When I thought, oh, I'll just go and make a list of all the non-ELN software to see what's out there. Little did I know how huge my list would be. I also conducted different types of qualitative research. So I ran focus groups with physicists, biologists, and chemists to understand the actual current landscape of what they were doing from a digitization and paper perspective, and to talk to them in depth about their work. I also conducted ethnography in laboratories. So I got to don a lab coat and safety goggles for the first time since school and venture into some of the different labs to observe people in their natural environment. So this is a really interesting experience, not least because it showed the immense diversity of the labs. One can only be described as having a computer graveyard in the corner of old CRT monitors that no one ever touched. So I'm not really sure what they were doing there. Many had computers linked up to instruments, so they did actually have a presence of technology, but didn't seem to want to use them for anything else. And believe some of them didn't actually have internet. One notable lab actually had a magnet in it so strong that you couldn't actually take your computer near it, concerning, and also I guess why you wouldn't want to pop your computer over there even if it did have an ELN on it. I also witnessed some really interesting behaviour, such as someone taking a crystal sample out of a cupboard, writing down some details in their lab book, inputting these values into one bit of software, running an experiment, writing down some more values, and then inputting them into a different piece of software at their desk. And when I queried why it had to be done this way, they told me that unfortunately their software didn't play well together, which has become a very strong theme of this research. I also worked on some technical prototypes, including semantic tagging and annotation and prototyping smart laboratory, which again have given some really interesting insights into how some of these technologies can work in the lab. So now I'm going to talk about the current landscape. So as part of the PSDI project, we ran an informal survey based off a lot of the investigative work I did in my PhD to get the lay of the land, but also to see if anything drastic had changed since COVID. So we felt like we already had quite a good idea of the landscape, but equally, the pandemic was massively disruptive, and the logic being, suddenly everyone was sent home, people were working from home, they could potentially no longer actually go into their labs or hand each other a lab book or be close enough to look at somebody's lab book or even get to their books if they were actually, not allowed into their office. So I did wonder if perhaps this would have sparked a bit of a change in environment and a change in how people were actually working. Certainly some colleagues at the university had mentioned small changes to me, such as one who had been pushing for ages to have electronic COSH forms. They wanted to have them in their OneNote, but their supervisor wanted paper versions. But actually suddenly with COVID, that gave them the push to go, well, I'm not going to come in and hand you a paper form that you can then touch and sign and give back to me. Ultimately, that's not safe. So it'll be in my OneNote. And so I did think, well, perhaps, this kind of safety aspect and actually not being able to have that interaction might have pushed some further changes. But also you never know. So I really wanted to investigate what was going on there. So firstly, let's talk about using paper and electronic methods to record work. So this slide shows the results of the survey, where we asked the question, for each of the following types of work, do you record it using paper, electronic methods, bit of both, or not applicable? This aligns pretty similarly with the view of the landscape we had several years ago. So, I mean, ultimately, what we've always known is that researchers work in different ways. They use a mix of paper and electronic methods, and different methods are more conducive to different things. So it's still more common to use paper for planning, and it's still a lot more common to use your computational methods for data analysis and write-up. I think based on the results we got this time around compared to when I was talking to people 4 years ago, there is a bit of a less just using paper. But equally, it's worth stressing this wasn't talking to the same people, because my results were looking at lots of different people in focus groups and talking to people across the university. We actually sent this survey out to the community. Again, the fact that we got quite similar results suggests that actually a lot of the community, well, are potentially working overall in similar ways. But there seems to be a bit of a reduction of paper, which is always a good thing. We also wanted to talk about organising and linking work, mainly because the logic being, well, if you have work in a paper lab notebook and work on a computer, which again, all throughout my PhD, all throughout talking to people now, through talking to people at conferences, etc., this is still a very strong thing that people have, particularly in academia. I believe some industry people still do this, but very much in academia, a lot of people have stuff in their paper notebooks and they have stuff on their computers. So I wanted to understand, is there any actually viable links between these, or is everything just really, really separate? Interestingly, so people have come up with some ways of kind of organising and linking stuff together between paper and electronic. They use codes, they use links. I mean, back in the day, sometimes people were even telling me they'd write down full actual file links in their lab notebook, so they could find, I've done this experiment, and actually if you go and look at this file link, that's where the data is. So I mean, in one sense, it's kind of good that people are putting those links in, they're coming up with their own systems. Arguably, it'd be a lot better if what was in the paper lab notebook was actually on a computer and was linked together. But what I did really notice about this compared to the last time around that I asked this question of people was that people cited using a lot more software. So when I asked this 4 years ago, the bottom bit, the bit in blue that talks about software use, that was much, much smaller. Whereas now people seem to have started using a lot more software, a lot more packages, a lot more different systems to actually organise and put their work together. And more things are turning up in electronic notebooking software. Just unfortunately, not everything in the lab notebook is still making its way in. So this is a landscape assessment of ELNs. So this was just again, when I first started looking at ELNs, I had no concept of how many ELNs are out there. Over 120 ELNs have been created in the last 2 decades, which is absolutely insane. I mean, obviously, yes, ELNs are substantially more specialist bits of software, but if you think about, say, word processing software, we have Word, and I guess we now have the web version of Word. We have Google Docs, we have Pages, there's LibreOffice, and there's maybe 1 or 2 others. But I mean, I'd be really shocked if there was more than 10. And certainly in terms of, the key players, the things that people use every day that they have on their computers, there's very few. So, I mean, this is absolutely crazy. Quite a few of these don't exist anymore, but there's still over 80 on the market. More are coming out every day. Some are disappearing. It's crazy. There's so many of them. Some of them are trying to be all purpose, one for all. Some have gone into slightly more specific disciplines. Some have different offerings across different disciplines. But I mean, what I'm really trying to demonstrate by this is that it's an absolute minefield. And if you come in as a young scientist and go, okay, I don't want to record everything on paper, let's put stuff in an ELN. How on earth are you meant to decide or choose? It's just crazy. There's so much of it, and it's just overwhelming. And there is no key player at the moment, which again makes it a bit more difficult. Something else that came out of our landscape assessment was looking at import and export formats of ELNs. So the reason we wanted to look at this is because when I've talked to people about using the ELNs, one of the key things they've always cited as a concern is, if I put my data into it, can I get my data back out of it? And if I get my data back out of it, what will that look like? And, I've actually asked people, I've gone to plenty of conferences, I've presented at different events, and a lot of those events have ELN vendors there. And I've said, oh, so, if I was to use your ELN and I wanted to get my data back out, how would I, and what could I get it back out in? And some of the responses were good, or you could get it out in all these different data formats, like fantastic, that's good to know. Other responses were a bit more, well, why would you need to? And the thing is, the reason you need to is whether you think that's valid or not, is people want to know that they can. They don't want to get locked in. They don't want their stuff to get put into proprietary formats. And what's interesting about the investigation we did, so I do want to sort of say up front, this was based on public information we could find. So, we don't have in-depth insight into all of the private companies' information, but where companies who run ELNs have made available information about what they have available for import and export, we took that information. And I just found it interesting that you can import a lot more than you can export out in. And potentially that might, that's not always great, because you might actually want to get something back out in the format you put it in. Obviously, it's nice that there are still export formats and I guess more of the common data formats. But given that one of the big issues we have are data standards, data formats, and things not being compatible, that's something to very much be aware of. And if you were going to use an ELN, I would always advise you to ask, how could I get my data back out? And what would it look like? And potentially, what would I lose from that? An interesting question that we asked our survey participants was, do you use a digital research notebook? So we kept this really obviously generic. So we didn't say lab notebook. We didn't give any examples, just because we wanted to see what people came up with. And I think it's really interesting that Jupyter was the most popular one. And that actually, which doesn't mean people aren't using ELNs and doesn't mean that everyone's using Jupyter. But I think it is quite interesting that clearly our sample size were using Jupyter, but that also that is now very much considered in that kind of research notebook sphere. I will say Jupyter is a huge change since 2018, not because of COVID at all, but because it was actually invented in 2018, or at least it came available. So it was only really coming into the forefront right at the end of my PhD, whereas now lots and lots and lots of people are using it, particularly if they're doing any sort of coding alongside their data analysis and their work. The fact that OneNote is also really popular, again, just shows something that we've been aware of for years, is that just because people, well, I say people, particularly academic people, aren't necessarily using electronic lab notebooks, it doesn't mean that they're not using some form of notebooking software. And indeed, some of the things I got out of my early investigations was that, yes, whilst a lot of work unfortunately does still reside in a paper notebook, people are digitizing, but they're not necessarily digitizing using the methods you'd expect. And actually, quite a lot of work does end up in OneNote, Google Docs, Microsoft Word. And I think it's really important that we're aware of that, and that in terms of thinking about software usage, we do think about making sure that things could actually play well with those types of documents. So we also asked people what software they use to share their data. We got quite a lot of different answers, as you can see, which we have catalogued. And something that I did notice that had changed from sort of last time we were having these conversations and putting out these surveys was that there's a lot more usage of communication and organizational software, which again, I think that very much probably is due to COVID, because actually suddenly we're not all in an office anymore. We've had to, you can't just lean across the desk and be like, hey, can I ask a question? Or like, hey, where's your data? Or can I look at your lab book? Whether we've managed to actually, take more work online, and obviously it very much depends how much you work with people, there has had to be an emphasis on actually still being able to communicate with people outside of the workplace. There's been a big switch to Microsoft Teams and Office 365, which again, I don't really think is due to COVID. I think it's possibly also due to data issues and trust issues. So Google Drive and Dropbox used to be used a lot more heavily, certainly at our university and at universities in general. And this was pre a lot of the universities signing up to get 365 subscriptions. Whereas once Google Drive became, there was a realization that it wasn't EEA compliant, a lot of universities actually went and said, no, we don't need to use Google Drive because we don't know where that data is being stored. Whereas, I mean, I can't speak for every university, but certainly for Southampton, we use SharePoint 365, and our data is actually stored locally within the university. So even though it's cloud-based, it's all safe and it's all within our university. So for anyone being concerned about where their data is going, you know, that's a very attractive option. I also noticed there's been a high use of software and scripts to share code, which again, I think with Jupyter notebooks and stuff like that coming into play, suddenly people have been able to do that. And then it's now quite common for people to collaborate using those notebooks. So we also asked people what other software they used in general. This is always something I've been interested in. So as I kind of mentioned at the beginning of this section, I actually went and looked at, you know, what different software packages exist for chemists and for different scientists that aren't ELNs. And that was an absolutely crazy amount of software. And even just asking, so this survey wasn't filled out by tons of people. We got 44 responses, and even 44 people cited over 200 different software packages in terms of the software that they regularly use with their work. So we categorized these using some of the categories from my PhD, and also came up with some other categories. But I think what this really demonstrates is people are using tons of software. And this is interesting for a few different ways. Firstly, I think because there's this perception that, you know, academics don't always digitize their work, a lot of stuff's lost in paper, which, you know, it is, and that universities aren't necessarily making massive use of ELNs, that almost like maybe they're not using software, but that's really not true. There are I mean, obviously, yeah, industry people filled this in as well, but there are so many different software packages, there's so many different software needs. And obviously some of this is more generic, you know, like communication software, database software, organizational software, but a lot of it is really domain specific. And I think that we really need to be aware of this, because I think sometimes there's the perception that if you're going to use an ELN or one bit of software, it should do everything. But actually that's just not realistic. You're not going to get one bit of software that does all the different things and all the different factors listed here. So maybe we just need to think a lot more about what actually needs to be used and how we can make these things play together. We also ran, as a cool experiment, we had a digital smart lab in our university. So this is just a prototype lab it was a physics lab. Because it was a laser lab, we made it quite a passive system. So we called it Talk to Lab, because the main point of it was to actually speak to the lab. So we set up some Echo dots, and we set up some Raspberry Pis and some sensors, and you could actually talk to the lab, and you could ask for different temperatures and different powers, which would allow you to get certain information about the laser, such as whether it was working or not. You could do that through voice. We also added some dashboards and some cameras. So we were basically trying to make quite an interactive smart lab to see how it worked, to have some fun, but also very much to ascertain how this could be useful. I mean, I really powerfully believe that voice is part of the future of the lab. How long that's going to take, I don't know. But given how intrusive and difficult people seem to find it to move away from paper, and I think part of that is because they don't, you know, quite apart from not necessarily having space for computers, they don't want to take their gloves off if they're handling something. They don't necessarily want to use a keyboard. They don't necessarily want to be restricted to the way you have to type into something if you're busy, if you're scrolling. But actually being able to use your voice, like, oh, please note this down, or log this value, or link with this, like, that's super useful. And also being able to actually ask questions rather than having to go over and look at particular bits of information. We also set up camera feeds because there were certain bits of equipment where you couldn't actually set it up without another person. So you needed two people to be able to view it, to get the right things in place, whereas actually having a camera there eradicated the need for the other person. So we're very much, and that was one of the things that people said were really useful. They found the dashboards very useful because they could get a lot of information in one go. So when we talked to the people about the lab, they were very pro all the bits that saved them time. And they wanted more of that. So they kind of said, oh, you know, my massive pain point is if something goes wrong with the laser, I don't know about it. I come back hours later and my experiment's gone wrong ages ago. So if you can set up warnings to me that will mitigate that, that'd be really, really useful. They found some of the voice stuff useful, but again, this wasn't great because there were issues with noise. There were issues with using chemical names. I mean, I've got to be honest, I can't pronounce half of them, so I'm not sure how I expect Alexa to understand what I'm saying. When I'm not sure I'm saying it right. Although I will say we're obviously using off-the-shelf software here, and I think that companies have definitely made leaps and bounds since we made this lab. I mean, it was really interesting, actually. I went to Lab Innovations in 2019 with a colleague, and we spoke to a load of the ELN companies and LIMS companies, and we said, are you interested in voice? Are you doing anything with this? And everyone said, pretty much everyone apart from I think one company said no. And it really didn't seem to be remotely prevalent. Fast forward to now, there are multiple voice companies, companies working on smart lab assistants. I've actually spoken to quite a few of them. They seem to have solved quite a lot of the issues that we encountered, and they're now working with some ELN companies. So yeah, I've talked to Lab Twin, Lab Voice, Elementa. All of them sound like they're doing really cool stuff. So I think that's really interesting and really positive. The voice in these systems seem to have taken off massively in the last 4 years. So I guess to kind of sum up a bit, COVID has made some changes. We're using more digital tools, that there's a lot more focus on digital tools to communicate. And some data and some stuff has been put in a more electronic form. And as I've just said, I've noticed a much higher prevalence of companies working on, lab voice. I don't think the voice aspect is necessarily due to COVID. It's also probably due to advance in technologies. But we have seen some changes over the last 4 years. And there has been a higher uptake of software, task management, software, note-taking. But unfortunately, we still haven't really got a viable solution to improving and increasing digitization. It's almost like there's more software, there's more offerings, people are doing more things, but a lot of the issues are still the same. And I'm going to kind of cover these in the next section when I talk about the barriers to digital research. So unfortunately, that there are still quite a lot of barriers. So these barriers are made up of all of the things that were cited as issues, throughout the last how many years of me doing the research, but also some that were very specifically identified when we ran our most recent survey. So logistical barriers, cost is always going to be a barrier. I mean, probably to pretty much anything, and time. And unfortunately, these are the two of the ones that are hardest to combat, I think. So certainly from a university perspective, obviously, a lot of ELNs, LIMS, any sort of specialist software to help manage digitization costs money. And there isn't always money in the budget for that. And time is a huge one because, projects are often really short. Do you necessarily have time to learn a whole new system or implement a whole new system or a strategy, that might take a year if the project's 4 months? Well, no, you don't, unfortunately. And there's also a lot of issues in actually how long it's going to take to convince people. So these are still really, really big barriers. I'd be lying if I said I knew how to solve them, but I think it's important that we know what the barriers are. And I guess one of the things would be to try and educate people more at an earlier stage and get people more into good practices earlier. So then hopefully when they come to do projects, at least the time curve to do this won't be as much of a problem. Unfortunately, I do think that probably the biggest barrier is people, which is both good and bad. Good from the perspective that if we're the problem, we could also be the solution, and we probably have the most power to change this one. But it is also a really big issue. So people don't necessarily want to change, they don't necessarily want to adopt new systems. So I have to say, because I sit in academia, I have worked in industry, but I have spent the majority of my working life in academia. And I've always kind of assumed the people in industry would have had it better, because, it's a company. You could just mandate the people do it a certain way. Surely that's simpler than a university with, lots of different departments, different supervisors, not necessarily being able to mandate a particular strategy or a particular bit of software. But actually recently, having spoken to a lot of people at a lot of these events, that's not necessarily the case. And actually, when we talked about trying to have sort of cohesive data strategies or to do things, this is more on the research data management side of things, but trying to actually have a uniform strategy, refer to things consistently, do things in the same way, use the same products. By all accounts, that's every bit as difficult in industry, and people want to do things their own way, unfortunately. And also, again, training's sort of a big issue. And this comes back to that socio-technical thing that I was talking about with websites, and why this is so fascinating but so difficult, is that the people are just as important as the technology. And we could have the best bits of software in the world, but if the people aren't willing to engage, then it's not going to work. There's also data barriers. So, you know, I won't go into things massively because I'm aware I'm a little bit pushed on time. So if you want to hear more about data stuff, come and talk to me. But unfortunately, data isn't fair. It's not always following the FAIR principles. So it's not always findable, accessible, interoperable, or reusable. Lack of metadata is a real problem. Metadata is really useful. We need it for context and we need it to provide more information. But it's also really time consuming to capture that metadata and also to figure out what metadata we should be having. I mean, I've sat down with scientists and we've looked at the metadata schemas and they've just said, well, this just looks unintelligible. There's too much of it. What do I break down? What do I use? So again, we need more education, more best practices about that. And also just having massive data sets that people can't access. Standards is a big problem. There's a lot of standards, there's a lot of formats, but there also aren't enough, which feels like a dual issue. And it's not always possible to convert between them. So if you have one bit of software that has, you know, data in one format and another bit of software that needs data in another format, and there isn't a way to convert between them, that is going to be an issue. And there's always concerns when you come to use any commercial software about being locked into their proprietary formats and then not being able to actually get your data out in any form of usable fashion. There's general barriers to specifically using an ELN. So these are ones cited from a different survey that I did quite a few years ago in relation to one of my research papers. But essentially but a lot of these barriers still really hold true today, even though this survey was done several years ago. Again, cost is clearly mentioned here. Not being as easy to use as paper, not necessarily being able to use it in the lab, so concerns about having to duplicate the work, data portability, and again, data being tied into a commercial package. All of these barriers and all of these issues are kind of combining together to be very similar. And then you've also got hardware and software barriers. So we need software to actually be more compatible with each other. There's also real concerns about security. So and I don't think this is necessarily true. I mean, it really depends on the software, but I think there's a lot of concern about using cloud-based software. Some of that's viable, like where is it stored in the cloud, for example? Is it adhering to the rules of my research or my project? You know, that's very valid. Equally, I think sometimes people get very, very concerned about things like cloud-based software, but then they'll wander around with an unprotected memory state that they could easily lose or someone could just take off them. So I think we need further education around the different aspects of trust and data and hardware and software and what is actually reliable and what isn't. Then, so the final bit of this presentation is I want to talk about the technical and data requirements. So what do users want? And then I'm going to talk a bit about our vision of how we think PSDI can work and some of the work we're planning to do in the future. So what do users want? This is a long and yet very cut down table. So we asked people what they wanted. We asked people all the different features that they wanted. Also, so this table doesn't just come from the survey. This table literally comes from the last 8 years of research where we went through looking at all the papers, talking to loads and loads of different people, looking at loads and loads of different survey results, and basically writing down all the different features and all the different things that people wanted to make their research better. These have all been kind of categorized into different features. There is a much bigger, richer descriptive table of this. So if anyone is interested in that, obviously get in touch with me and I can give you the whacking great page longs table, which provides more information. But to sum up, they want a lot of different things. And you know, some of it's notebooking, but some of it's also a lot of things around data, collaboration management, support for coding, also metadata and semantics and AI. Now, some of these are maybe a little bit more tenuous in terms of people knowing that they want them. But when people talk about wanting consistency, wanting context, wanting to understand what they're talking about, wanting things to link together, those do align with those technologies. They're just not necessarily registering that that's what they're after. So software integration is really, really important. We need better software integration. People are using tons of different types of software. So some of the work we plan on doing for this project is identifying the software that's really popular with the scientific community and also what meets the different needs. And then we want to try and find ways of integrating between this. So a really useful analogy we had at one of the conferences was my iPhone has a ton of different apps, and that's fine because a lot of the time I don't need all of my apps to talk to each other. I don't need my train app to talk to my shopping app. that's not useful to me. But I do like the fact that all my health apps talk to each other, like my Fitbit and my Strava and my Apple Health, because that is useful, because I want to be able to connect things together and see those different data aspects. I do want my Apple Pay to connect to my shopping app, because then I can pay for things using that. So some of the things we need to do, we need to identify what's actually okay as a standalone bit of software, which bits of software actually really need to work together, and then how can we make that work? Do we need middleware? Do we need to work on data format conversion? And we also really need to work on building confidence and trust in the security of these different software systems where appropriate. As I said, there's both a saturation and lack of data standards. So we want to look at identifying common data and metadata standards, both from a generic perspective and also a domain-specific perspective. We want to look at which ones are being most widely adopted and where there are gaps. And then we want to look at how we can potentially convert between these different formats. And we need to look at tools to enable fair data. As I said, users don't necessarily know that they want this, but based on a lot of the things they've said and the needs they've identified, there is a requirement for semantically enriching documents. So we really need to do work on this. We need to look at the relevant ontologies and schemas and how these can be used well and in a kind of non-intrusive, non-bloated methods with notebooking domain-based software. And also how we can potentially do some of this annotation and markup. Finally, as I said, I firmly believe, and this is one of the reasons I'm so pro-voice, is that I don't think the lab of the future involves the keyboard. I just don't think it's viable. I don't think you're ever going to persuade everybody to down tools, put their pens down, stop scrolling away in a notebook and type something into a more formal system with a keyboard. I mean, some people might do that, but I just don't think everyone's going to do that. So I think if you can have voice, also potentially hybrid devices, so smart notebooks, tablets, things like your Remarkables, your iPads, that you're going to have a much better bet of actually getting some of that work digitized in the lab. And ultimately we have smart homes, so surely now is the time for smart labs. So this diagram is just a bit of a vision of our PSDI infrastructure. So we kind of see ourselves as the missing puzzle piece. We're not looking to reinvent the wheel. We're not looking to make a new platform, make a new ELN, make a new bit of software. We are looking to figure out how we can make all of the actually really useful things that are already out there play well together. We're looking to figure out how we can educate people better. What training resources do we need to provide? Can we provide better services and links to data, for example? Essentially, we want to serve as a useful infrastructure for the physical sciences community. And a lot of the work we're doing over the next year is research towards how we can make improvements in this area. So just some conclusions. We need to digitize more, but we need to solve two digitization problems. We need to get more data into a digital format in the first place. So that's kind of from the lab. But we also need to handle all the digital data we have better, because just because it's digital doesn't mean it's well managed. We need people. So interestingly, a lot of the desired features linked to that second bit, so managing your data better, but a lot of the barriers are a lot more linked to people. So we need to kind of figure out how to mitigate that, and we need everyone to actually work together on this to try and push forward to actually work on managing the data better. And we need to enable the future. We need better methods for scientists to record their research and to work with the laboratory in a way that doesn't necessarily involve the use of a keyboard. So this is just a nod to some relevant publications written by myself and members of the group. And then I would just like to acknowledge and thank all the different lovely people that I have worked with throughout my PhD and all of these different projects. And thank you very much for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Samantha. That was a fantastic presentation. And I can see that we received some questions already, so I'll move straight on to those. So your first question is, what do you think the biggest barrier is to digitization today?
So unfortunately, I do think it is people, which, as I said, is both bad and good. Bad because it's us, and good because we have the biggest power to change that. Ultimately, so much of it is we need a change of attitude, we need a change of education, we need to change things right from the beginning. I mean, I think some of this is kind of learned behavior. So, I understand why at schools maybe there's a much higher use of paper and stuff, and I don't really know the in-depth of it, but I'm aware there is sort of research on, learning better if you sort of physically write things down and stuff. And obviously, you need people to be able to write properly. I know my handwriting suffered since moving to using computers, but I think, you come to university to do a scientific degree, or even myself actually coming to university to do a computer science degree. And maybe this is different in my department now, but we were handed lab books, paper lab books. I mean, for me, that was mostly to write kind of a sort of small report on my code to hand over at the end of my labs, which consisted of writing code and have them be marked. But for obviously the scientists, they're immediately put into that sort of learned behavior of, here's your lab book, write your stuff in it, we'll mark it, that's where it is. And so by the time they actually get to things like master's, PhD, that's the way they've been taught. So to an extent, unless they're given other options and given other training, they're not necessarily going to do anything differently. And also when I was doing my ethnography and when I was talking to people, it was back during my PhD, it was very obvious how some of them have been quite like supervisor led. So the people that were more interested in, say, actually, making an effort to digitize, or thought perhaps that ELNs or digitizing was a good plan, they've been quite led by supervisors that were really pro that, and the people that were really against it, their supervisors were quite against it. So again, you have quite an authoritative lead there. And I've looked at sort of different aspects of technology adoption. And there's also like, I mean, some of it is things like perceived ease of use. Is this going to save me time? Am I going to be able to use it? Is it going to be better than that? And I think there's also that kind of emphasis on if people aren't necessarily willing to change unless they think they're changing up for something better rather than like the same, even if arguably there are actually advantages to that change. And then that kind of perception that if, unless you can get everyone to adopt something, then one person isn't really going to bother. So there's a lot of different social and people aspects around that. I mean, obviously it isn't all people. And said a lot of the other barriers and logistics I mentioned, things like software not playing well together, data formats, data issues. And I think another big problem potentially is all of these kind of proprietary formats from companies. Again, I do understand from a commercial perspective, obviously there's like potentially an advantage to you to locking down data and having it in your format, but that's obviously not going to help the general open science digitization effort. But yes, unfortunately, I probably would still put people at the top of that list.
That's great, thank you. I'll move on to your next question now. What quick wins can be implemented to improve digitisation?
So I mean, obviously this does depend on the sort of lab you work in. But I think, to me, any quick win is just any small improvement we can make. So to me, a quick win in, say, just, if we break down this kind of two-stage problem, digitizing more and digitizing better, I think there's probably a lot more quick wins to be had in digitizing more. So for example, just taking a picture of something could be, to me, a quick win. So I mean, obviously one of my slides I'd drawn that kind of like mind map diagram. I personally find those substantially easier to put into practice if I do them on paper. I made one of those actually for each one of the sort of big focus group areas I had for my PhD. And I drew them all out on paper because drawing them out on paper is easier. But then I took photographs of them. I actually left them in photographs for years until I needed to actually digitize them properly, but they existed. So I think sometimes, even if you're just going to put something in a digital form, as much as a picture or a photocopy or something like that, even if you're not actually doing anything with it yet, it does at least exist. So I think from a digitizing perspective, that would probably be one of the quick wins. In terms of managing your data better, I mean, that's a bit harder because obviously it also really depends on the size of the team you're working in and what's going on. I think potentially just, and it's going to sound really trivial, but I don't think everyone does it, just putting everything in one place. We use lots of different files, and particularly chemists, but I guess all the different scientists, but particularly chemists have lots of different data and documents and files and all different sorts. And one of the things that people said to me when I was asking them what they really wanted during my PhD was, we want everything in one place. Now, obviously, like having an ELN or having a particular bit of software that has everything in one place isn't particularly viable. But actually, just having a Microsoft Teams, just having a SharePoint and whacking everything in, even if you then need to use specific different bits of software or move things, or copy and open things in different places to actually get to them, if everything's in one place that everyone can actually get to in your, respective group, surely to me that's at least a win in terms of data organization, even if there's still a lot more work to be done.
That's great, thank you. I think we've got time for a couple of more questions. And your next question is, what are we missing to make headway with improving digitisation?
I think one of the big things we are missing is cohesive data standards and software integration. Because I guess for a long time I was thinking maybe everyone just needs to use Word, maybe everyone just needs to use Google Docs, maybe I'd kind of conceptualized like a layered system, almost generic notebooking, domain-based stuff, and then a semantic metadata layer on top. And I was almost like, maybe we need a piece of software that does all of that. But the more I look at all the different software, all the different options, all the different things people are using, and also just how much the even the companies that run these things have massively expanded out. I mean, when I looked at all the ELNs and all the software that was out there 4 years ago, a lot of companies just made ELNs. Now there's so much software, and so many of them have sort of massively revolutionized what they've got as offerings. They've got data management systems, they've got whole research platforms of their notebook is just a small part of. They've got inventories, they've got limbs associated with there's so much stuff. So I think we're never going to get everyone to sit down and just use one bit of software. I think the companies that are potentially working on big platforms that have all these different aspects, they're moving in the right direction. But I still think there needs to be that level of I guess cohesive data standards and formats where and integration where people could go and use the things they need to use, and it all still actually work together. I think also education and just general strategies. And I think one of the other things we are missing, and again, I don't think necessarily everyone, I don't think people will necessarily all agree with me, and maybe isn't even obvious, is underlying ontologies, metadata, and semantic enrichment. Because again, one of the big things people have said is an issue is that people don't do things consistently. And actually one of the things I found out is that people like to do things their own personal way. They don't like being shoehorned into using specific methods or specific terminology. But then you get lots of inconsistent data and things that are talking about the same thing potentially, but you don't know that. If you have underlying ontologies and taxonomies and those data structures underneath it, you could almost give people that level of personalization, but also have the underlying data structures to say, but this is all still the same thing. And now we can search on it and we can know what they're talking about.
That's great. Thank you, Sam. And just moving on to your final question for today. What can the community do to help progress digitisation?
So I think there's a lot of different things the community can do. I think we need to provide more education, and I think we need to start people early. So I guess and again, I appreciate this is difficult and people are maybe confined by what they actually have to teach, etc., etc. But to me, if I was, say, running a chemistry course or running a scientific course or a scientific module, the use of software and actually having to provide your work in a digital format, to me, would be part of that. And teaching people how to do it and teaching people the importance of doing it. Similarly, coming into a company, I guess, training on those things and having best practices would be part of that, and would be saying, if you're going to, much like, I've worked in multiple software companies, even though they're all slightly different, those companies all had their own best practices about how they wanted you to code, like what coding style they wanted you to use, how they wanted you to comment your code, and what they wanted your variable names to look like. Again, having sort of similar best practices in again, pharmaceutical, chemistry, scientific companies about their data and about how they record things and they document things would be really, really useful. But I think also we need to open our minds to work together as well, because to an extent, if everyone's doing different things, that's also quite hard to be cohesive. So I think from an industrial perspective, using common data formats could be a really useful thing to do. From an academic perspective, again, working together and maybe working cross department and trying to come up with some better practices for students so that they learn these things early on. And also sharing things, so providing not just training resources and educational resources, but also if somebody has made the effort to go through and be like, these are all the different things, say these different software does, or this is the best practice route to do this sort of thing, or to record this sort of data, sharing it with the community can be very useful.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Samantha. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Any questions that we didn't have time to get to will be sent to the speaker after the event. And as with all the talks in the event, this talk will now be made available to view whenever you want for the next 30 days. That just leaves me to say thanks everyone for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we will be back soon tomorrow at 8 AM PST with some more fantastic talks from our speakers and our sponsors. Goodbye.